The fluorescent lights buzzed softly in the hallway of Riverside Nursing Home as Maria pushed her cart down the corridor. It was almost midnight and most of the residents were asleep. Her feet ached in her worn sneakers, the same ones she'd been wearing for nearly 2 years now. She couldn't afford new ones yet, not with rent due next week and her son needing new glasses. Maria had been working at Riverside for 3 years, taking the night shift because it paid an extra $1.50 per hour. Every penny mattered when you were raising 2 kids on your own. Her daughter Lily was 8, and her son Tommy had just turned 6. They were staying with her neighbor Mrs. Chen tonight, like they did every night Maria worked. She hated being away from them, but this was how she kept a roof over their heads. The nursing home wasn't fancy. The wallpaper was peeling in some corners, and the carpet had stains that wouldn't come out no matter how hard the cleaning crew scrubbed. But it was clean enough and the residents were safe. That's what Maria told herself every time she walked through those doors. She stopped at room 247 and took a deep breath. This was Edward's room. The other nurses complained about him constantly. He was difficult, they said. He cried out at odd hours. He refused to eat. He knocked over water cups and pushed away helping hands. The day shift supervisor had even suggested they request a transfer for him to a higher security wing. But Maria saw something different when she looked at Edward. He was 87 years old with thin white hair and hands that shook when he tried to hold a spoon. His eyes were blue, faded like old denim, and sometimes when he looked at her, she swore she could see her own father looking back. Her father had died 5 years ago, back in her hometown. She hadn't been able to afford the trip to see him before he passed. That guilt lived in her chest like a stone, heavy and cold. Maybe that's why she spent extra time with Edward. Maybe she was trying to make up for what she couldn't do for her own dad. She knocked softly and entered the room. Edward was awake, staring at the ceiling. His hands were picking at the blanket, a repetitive motion that the nurses said meant he was agitated. "Hey there, Mr. Edward," Maria said gently, setting down her cart. "Can't sleep tonight?" He didn't respond. He rarely did. The dementia had taken most of his words away. According to his file, he'd been a teacher once, had traveled the world, had loved classical music and old movies. Now most days he didn't even seem to know where he was. Maria pulled up the chair beside his bed and sat down. This wasn't part of her official duties. She was supposed to check his vitals, make sure he was clean and comfortable, and move on to the next room. There were 15 other residents on this wing who needed care. But something about leaving Edward alone in the dark just felt wrong. "I had a long day today," she said, even though she knew he probably couldn't understand her. Tommy fell off the swing at school. Nothing broken, just some scrapes, but he cried so hard. Kids are tougher than we think, though. He was laughing again by dinner time. She reached out and took his hand. It was cool and dry, the skin paper-thin. His fingers stopped their restless picking and wrapped loosely around hers. "You know what always made my kids feel better when they were sad?" Maria continued. "My grandmother's songs. She used to sing to me when I was little back in Mexico. My mom taught them to me and I taught them to my babies." Edward's eyes had closed, but his hand still held hers. Maria began to hum, soft and low. Then the words came. Gentle Spanish lyrics about the moon and stars, about angels watching over sleeping children. Her grandmother used to say these songs were older than memory, passed down through so many generations that no one knew where they came from anymore. As she sang, something remarkable happened. The tension in Edward's face melted away. The lines around his eyes smoothed out. A single tear rolled down his weathered cheek, but he was smiling. Actually smiling, Maria felt her own throat tighten. She kept singing, one song flowing into another. Songs about morning sun and evening rain. Songs about home and family and love that never dies. She didn't know how long she sat there. Time felt different in these quiet moments. It could have been 10 minutes or an hour. When she finally stopped singing, Edward was breathing deeply, peacefully asleep. Maria gently laid his hand back on the blanket and stood up. Her back protested, stiff from sitting in the uncomfortable chair. She still had 12 more rooms to check before her shift ended at 6 in the morning. As she pushed her cart down the hallway, she thought about her own situation. The medical bills from Lily's surgery 2 years ago were crushing her. Her daughter had needed an emergency appendectomy, and even with the payment plan, Maria was drowning in debt. $23,000 might as well have been $23 million. Her ex-husband had left right after that, said he couldn't handle the stress. The stress of what? Having a sick child? Having to actually be responsible for another human being? Maria pushed the bitter thoughts away. She didn't have energy for anger anymore. She barely had energy to stay on her feet. She'd been trying to finish her nursing degree for 4 years now, taking one online class per semester when she could afford it. At this rate, she'd graduate when she was 50. But a registered nurse made almost twice what she made as a caregiver. With that kind of money, she could get a small house instead of their cramped apartment. She could buy her kids new clothes instead of thrift store finds. She could maybe, just maybe, stop feeling like she was one flat tire away from complete disaster. The rest of her shift passed in the usual rhythm. Check vitals, help Mrs. Rodriguez to the bathroom, change Mr. Kim's bedding, document everything in the charts. She grabbed a stale coffee from the break room and ate half a sandwich she'd brought from home, saving the other half for tomorrow. At 5:30 in the morning, she returned to Edward's room one last time before the day shift arrived. He was still sleeping peacefully, his face calm. She adjusted his blanket and checked his water pitcher. "See you tonight, Mr. Edward," she whispered. As she gathered her things from her locker and headed to the parking lot, the sun was just starting to rise. The sky was turning pink and gold, beautiful in a way that almost made her forget how tired she was. She had 45 minutes to get to Mrs. Chen's apartment, pick up her kids, get them breakfast, and drop them at school before the late bell rang. Maria climbed into her old Honda, the one with the check engine light that had been on for 6 months. She couldn't afford to fix whatever was wrong, so she just prayed it would keep running a little longer. She didn't know that her life was about to change. She didn't know that someone had been watching her with Edward, had seen her kindness, had witnessed the way she gave everything she had to people who couldn't pay her back. She didn't know that singing those simple songs in the dark had set something in motion that would transform not just her life, but the lives of countless others. All she knew, as she drove through the quiet morning streets, was that she'd be back tonight, and she'd sing to Edward again, because it was the right thing to do. Because everyone deserved to feel less alone, because kindness didn't cost anything and it was the only wealth she had to give. And sometimes, that's enough. James Thornton stood in the parking lot of Riverside Nursing Home, his hand resting on the door handle of his Tesla. He didn't want to go inside. He never wanted to go inside. It had been 18 months since he'd placed his father here, and the guilt still ate at him every single day. People told him he'd made the right choice. The doctors said it. His therapist said it. His business partner said it. But none of them had to live with the look on his father's face that last day at home, when Edward had stared at him like he was a complete stranger and asked him to leave his house. James was 42 years old and worth over $200 million. He'd built his tech company from nothing, working 18-hour days in a cramped apartment, eating ramen noodles and dreaming of success. When the company finally sold, he'd paid off his father's mortgage, bought him a new car, took him on a cruise to Alaska. All the things he'd promised himself he'd do when he made it big. But money couldn't fix everything. It couldn't stop dementia from stealing his father away piece by piece. It couldn't make Edward recognize his own son anymore. James had tried keeping his father at home with round-the-clock care. But Edward had become violent with the home health aides, throwing things, shouting, once even trying to hit someone with his cane. The doctors explained it was the disease, that Edward felt threatened by strangers in his space, that his brain couldn't process what was happening to him. The nursing home was supposed to be temporary, just until they found the right medication combination. That was a year and a half ago. James took a deep breath and walked toward the entrance. It was late, almost 11 at night, but he preferred coming after visiting hours. Fewer people around, fewer questions about why he never came during the day, why he didn't sit with his father in the common room like other families did. The truth was, he couldn't bear it, watching his father, the man who had taught him to ride a bike and helped him with homework and sat in the front row at his college graduation, reduced to confusion and fear. It broke something inside James that he didn't know how to fix. He signed in at the desk and headed toward the administrative wing. He had a meeting scheduled with the nursing director to discuss Edward's care plan. His father had been losing weight, refusing meals more often. They wanted to discuss feeding tubes and other interventions that made James feel sick to even think about. As he walked down the corridor toward the director's office, he passed his father's wing. The hallway was dim, lit only by small nightlights plugged into the walls. He could hear a television playing somewhere and the soft beep of a medical monitor. Then he heard something else. Singing. James stopped walking. The voice was quiet, barely audible, but it was definitely singing. And it was coming from his father's room. He moved closer, his expensive shoes silent on the worn carpet. The door to room 247 was slightly ajar, and through the gap, he could see a sliver of the room inside. There was a woman sitting beside his father's bed. She wore pale blue scrubs and her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail. She was holding Edward's hand and she was singing to him in Spanish. James didn't understand the words, but the melody was beautiful, haunting, like a lullaby from another time. But what stopped James cold, what made his breath catch in his throat, was his father's face. Edward was smiling, not the confused half-smile James had seen during awkward visits. Not the polite expression people with dementia sometimes wore when they didn't understand what was happening. This was real. His father's eyes were closed and there were tears on his cheeks, but he was peaceful. Happy even. James hadn't seen his father look like that in over 2 years. He stood there, frozen in the doorway, watching this stranger give his father something he thought was lost forever. Peace. Comfort. A moment of joy in the confusion. The woman finished her song and gently laid Edward's hand back on the blanket. She stood up, stretching her back, and for a moment James thought she might see him. But she turned to her card in the corner and began making notes on a clipboard. James quietly stepped back into the shadows and made his way to the director's office. His mind was racing. The meeting with Director Patterson lasted 40 minutes, but James barely heard half of it. He agreed to the recommended changes to Edward's meal plan, signed the necessary forms, and asked what seemed like appropriate questions. But his thoughts kept drifting back to that room, that song, that moment of peace on his father's face. "Before I go," James said as he stood to leave, "who's assigned to my father's care on the night shift?" Director Patterson checked her computer. "That would be Maria Santos. She's one of our nursing assistants. Has there been a problem?" "No," James said quickly. "No problem. I want to make sure he's being well cared for." "Maria's very dedicated," Patterson said, though something in her tone suggested there was more to that story. Almost too dedicated, if I'm being honest. She spends extra time with the residents, which sometimes puts her behind on her other duties. We've had to speak with her about time management a few times." James nodded, filing that information away. After he left the office, he didn't go straight to his car. Instead, he found a chair in a waiting area near his father's wing and sat down. He told himself he was just taking a moment before the drive home. But really, he was thinking. Over the next 3 weeks, James changed his routine. He started coming to Riverside at different times, always unannounced. Sometimes in the early evening, sometimes late at night, once even at dawn. He never went into his father's room when Maria was there. Instead, he watched from the hallway or through the small observation window in the door. He saw her bring flowers and put them in a small vase on Edward's nightstand. He saw her showing his father old photographs, talking to him about what was in the pictures even though Edward probably couldn't understand. He saw her singing to him, always those same gentle Spanish songs, and every single time, his father's face would relax into that peaceful expression. One night, James arrived just as Maria was leaving Edward's room. He ducked into a doorway as she passed, and he noticed that she was limping slightly. Her shoes were held together with tape along one side. He started asking questions. Discreet questions. He spoke with other staff members during his visits, always casual, never revealing too much about why he wanted to know. He learned that Maria was a single mother working double shifts, that she was trying to finish nursing school, but could barely afford 1 class per semester, that she often brought homemade soup for residents who were having trouble eating the facility food, that she'd been written up twice for spending too much time with patients. James learned that Maria had spent her own money to print out photographs from the 1950s after she'd looked up information about Edward from his intake forms. She'd created a small memory book trying to stimulate cognitive function, trying to give his father some connection to his past, all on her own time, all for a man she'd been told had no family who visited. That last part stung. The staff didn't know that James came regularly. They probably thought Edward had been abandoned, just another forgotten old man. One evening, James watched through the window as Maria sat with his father. She was showing him the memory book she'd made, pointing at pictures of old New York streets, vintage cars, the Yankee Stadium from decades ago. Edward had grown up in New York. These were scenes from his childhood, places James had only heard about in stories. His father reached out with a shaking hand and touched one of the photographs. He said something too quiet for James to hear through the glass. But Maria's face lit up with excitement. She was actually engaging with him, getting responses, making connections that all the expensive specialists hadn't been able to make. James pulled out his phone and, feeling only slightly guilty about it, recorded a short video through the window, Maria singing, his father smiling, that moment of pure human connection. He watched the video 3 times in his car before driving home to his empty penthouse apartment. And for the first time since his father's diagnosis, James felt something shift inside him. Not hope exactly, but something close to it. He didn't know yet what he was going to do with this information. He just knew that this woman, this underpaid caregiver who was barely scraping by, had given his father something that all of James's money couldn't buy. And somehow, some way, he was going to make sure she knew that what she was doing mattered. The question was how. Maria's shift had ended 20 minutes ago, but she was still sitting in her car in the Riverside parking lot. The engine was off because she couldn't afford to waste gas, and the November air was cold enough that she could see her breath. She was trying not to cry. The letter from the community college sat on the passenger seat. They were dropping her from the nursing program. She'd missed too many tuition payments, and despite her appeals and her explanations, the answer was final. 3 years of classes gone. All those nights studying after her shifts, all those practice exams, all that hope just gone. She'd been so close. Just 2 more semesters and she would have had her RN license. 2 more semesters and she could have doubled her income, moved her kids out of that cramped apartment, maybe even saved some money for once in her life. Maria wiped her eyes and started the car. She couldn't fall apart. Lily and Tommy were waiting at Mrs. Chen's apartment, probably already awake and wondering where their mom was. She needed to hold it together, make them breakfast, get them to school, and pretend that everything was fine. That's what you did when you were a single parent. You kept going. Over the next few weeks, Maria threw herself into work even harder than before. If she couldn't be a registered nurse, she'd be the best caregiver she could possibly be. She picked up extra shifts when the facility was short-staffed. She stayed late to help with residents who were having difficult nights. And every evening she spent time with Edward, singing to him, talking to him, showing him the memory book she'd made. He was responding more now. Small things mostly. A squeeze of her hand, a word or two. Once, when she showed him a picture of the old Yankee Stadium, he'd said DiMaggio, clear as day. She'd nearly jumped out of her chair with excitement. She didn't notice that someone was watching her more carefully than ever. James had made a decision. He couldn't just walk away from what he'd witnessed. This woman had given his father more comfort and dignity in a few months than James had managed in years. But he needed to understand more. He needed to know who Maria really was before he did anything. He hired a private investigator. It felt invasive and he wasn't proud of it, but he needed information. Within a week, he had a full report on Maria Santos. Single mother of 2. Divorced 3 years ago. Medical debt from her daughter's emergency surgery. Working 60-hour weeks between Riverside and occasional weekend shifts at a retail store. Behind on rent twice in the past year. Car barely running. And the most recent update, dropped from nursing school due to non-payment. James sat in his home office reading the report for the 3rd time. This woman had nothing. She was barely surviving. And yet she spent her own money on flowers and photographs for his father. She stayed late without overtime pay to sing to lonely old people. She gave everything she had to people who couldn't give anything back. He thought about his own life. The penthouse apartment he barely spent time in. The luxury cars. The investment portfolio. The vacation home in Aspen he'd visited twice in 3 years. He had more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, and this woman couldn't afford new shoes. It wasn't fair. But more than that, it wasn't right. James started visiting the facility more frequently. Always watching. Always learning. He saw Maria arrive early for her shifts despite not getting paid for that time. He saw her share her dinner with a confused resident who'd knocked his own meal onto the floor. He saw her calm a woman who was screaming about imaginary intruders. Not with medication, but with patience and a soft voice and gentle hands. The other staff members worked efficiently, professionally. They did their jobs and they did them well. But Maria did something different. She cared. Really cared. You couldn't fake what he saw in her interactions. It came from somewhere deep, somewhere genuine. One cold December evening, James watched through the window as Maria showed his father a children's book. She was reading it to him, doing different voices for different characters, making his father laugh. Actually laugh. James hadn't heard his father laugh in years. That's when he knew he had to talk to her. Not as an anonymous observer, but face to face. He had to tell her what her kindness meant. And if she'd let him, he wanted to help her. Not as charity, but as recognition for what she'd given his father. He waited in the parking lot that night, sitting in his car 3 spaces away from Maria's old Honda. The Tesla looked ridiculously out of place among the beat-up vehicles in the employee section. When Maria finally emerged from the building at 6 in the morning, she looked exhausted. She was limping again, and she carried her bag like it weighed 100 pounds. James got out of his car and walked toward her. He'd rehearsed what he wanted to say, but as he got closer, he realized how this must look. A strange man approaching a woman alone in a dark parking lot before dawn. "Excuse me," he called out while he was still at a distance. "Maria Santos?" Maria froze, her hand going to the pepper spray on her keychain. Her heart was pounding. "Who are you? What do you want?" James raised his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to scare you. My name is James Thornton. I'm Edward's son." Maria's expression changed from fear to confusion. "Edward's son? But the file says he doesn't have any family listed." "I know," James said. "That's my fault. Can we talk, please? Just for a few minutes. There's a diner 2 blocks from here. It's open all night, public place, lots of people. I just need to talk to you about my father." Maria hesitated. Every instinct told her this was strange, possibly dangerous. But something in his voice made her pause. He sounded sincere, and more than that, he sounded sad. "I have to pick up my kids soon," she said carefully. 15 minutes, James said. "I promise. And if you want to leave at any time, you can. I'll even follow you there in my car so you know I'm not trying to trick you." 10 minutes later, they sat across from each other in a booth at Maggie's diner. The place smelled like coffee and bacon, and there were a handful of truckers and night shift workers scattered around. Maria had ordered just water, despite James offering to buy her breakfast. "So you're really Edward's son?" Maria asked, studying his face. Now that she looked at him, she could see the resemblance. The same blue eyes, the same shape of the jaw. "I am," James said. "And I need to tell you something. I've been watching you, with my father, for the past few weeks." Maria felt her stomach drop. "Watching me? Am I in trouble? Did I do something wrong?" "No," James said quickly. "God, no, the opposite. Maria, I need you to understand something. My father has severe dementia. He hasn't recognized me in over a year. He doesn't know who I am anymore. Do you understand how that feels? To look at your own father and have him see a stranger?" Maria nodded slowly. "I can't imagine how hard that must be. I put him in Riverside because he was becoming violent at home. He'd throw things, yell at the caregivers. The doctor said he needed professional care. I visited, but I couldn't. I couldn't handle watching him not know me. So I started coming at odd hours, just checking on him from a distance." James pulled out his phone and showed Maria the video he'd recorded. Her singing to Edward, his father's peaceful, smiling face. "I haven't seen my father look like that in 2 years," James said, and his voice cracked. "Not since before the diagnosis. You did that. Your songs, your kindness, your time. You gave him something I couldn't." Maria stared at the video, tears welling in her eyes. He reminds me of my own father. I didn't get to say goodbye when my dad died. I guess taking care of Edward feels like taking care of him, in a way." "I know about the memory book," James continued. "I know you printed those photos with your own money. I know you bring flowers from your garden. I know you stay late without getting paid. The staff told me you've been written up for spending too much time with patients. Maria's cheeks flushed. I should probably work faster, but I can't just leave them alone. They're people, not tasks on a checklist. James leaned forward. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Maria, I had this place investigated. I know you're struggling. I know. About nursing school, about your kids, about the medical debt. And I know that despite all that, despite barely having enough for yourself, you give everything to my father and the other residents. What do you want from me? Maria asked, confused and a little scared. This was all too much, too strange. James took a deep breath. I want to ask you a question, and I want you to really think about the answer. What would you need to take care of my father full-time, in a better setting, with resources, with help, with everything you need to do what you do best? If money wasn't an issue, if you could create the perfect care situation, what would that look like? Maria stared at him like he'd lost his mind. I don't understand what you're asking. I'm asking, James said carefully, what it would take to change your life, and maybe in the process change a lot of other lives too. Maria sat back in the booth, her mind racing. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. But James was looking at her with such intensity, such hope, that she couldn't help but consider the question. What would she need? What would she want? And for the first time in years, Maria let herself dream. Maria sat across from James in that diner booth, her coffee getting cold while her mind spun in circles. This had to be some kind of joke, or a dream. Or maybe she was so exhausted that she was hallucinating the whole thing. You want me to tell you what I'd need to take care of your father? She repeated slowly. Like you're offering me a job? James nodded. Not just a job. I'm asking you to help me create something. A place where my father and others like him can get the kind of care you've been giving him. Real care, not just medical management. Maria looked down at her hands. They were rough from years of work, her nails short and unpolished. She thought about all the times she'd imagined a better way to care for people like Edward. A place with natural light and comfortable furniture, where residents could have pets if they wanted, where there was time to actually talk to people, to learn their stories, to treat them like human beings instead of problems to be solved. I'd want it to feel like home, she said quietly. Not like a hospital. Real furniture, not those awful plastic chairs. Pictures on the walls, music. A kitchen where we could bake cookies because the smell of baking makes people remember good things. James was typing notes on his phone. Keep going. Enough staff so nobody's rushed. So you can sit with someone who's confused and scared, hold their hand, talk them through it. Train everyone to see the person, not just the disease. Maria's voice was getting stronger now. And not just warehousing people until they die. Activities that matter. Gardening if they can, art, music therapy. Things that connect them to who they used to be. What about you? James asked. What would you need? Maria laughed, but it came out bitter. Me? I'd need to finish nursing school so I actually know what I'm doing. I'd need to not be so tired all the time that I can barely think straight. I'd need my kids to be taken care of while I work. Not just babysat, but actually cared for. What if I told you I could make all of that happen? Maria looked up at him. Why would you do that? You don't know me. I know enough, James said. I know you spent your own money on flowers for my father. I know you made him a memory book on your day off. I know you were written up for caring too much. That tells me everything I need to know. This is crazy, Maria said, shaking her head. People like you don't just give people like me opportunities like this. There has to be a catch. James was quiet for a moment. The catch is that I need help. I have money, Maria, more than I'll ever spend. But money can't do what you do. I can buy the best facility in the world, hire the best doctors, get the finest equipment. But I can't buy compassion. I can't buy the way you make my father feel safe. That's not something you can train someone to do. You either have it or you don't. Maria felt tears burning in her eyes again. She'd cried more in the past hour than she had in months. I have to think about my kids, she said. Everything I do for them. I can't mess this up. I understand, James said. Go home. Think about it. Talk to your kids if you want. But Maria, I'm serious about this. I want to do this right, and I can't do it without you. He slid a business card across the table. Call me when you're ready to talk more, no pressure, but I hope you'll say yes. Maria picked up the card. James Thornton, CEO, Thornton Technologies. There was a phone number and an email address. She stared at it like it might disappear if she looked away. I need to go, she said. My kids are waiting. One more thing, James said as she started to stand. Your medical debt. From your daughter's surgery. How much is left? Maria froze. How do you know about that? I told you I had you investigated. I'm sorry if that feels invasive, but I needed to know who I was dealing with. How much? 23,000, Maria said quietly. Give or take. James pulled out his phone and typed something. What's your bank account number? What? No, absolutely not. Maria backed away from the table. I'm not taking your money. I don't even know you. You're not taking it. I'm paying a debt owed to someone who gave my father peace when I couldn't. Please, let me do this one thing while you think about the rest. Maria shook her head and walked out of the diner. Her hands were shaking as she drove to Mrs. Chen's apartment. This was too much. Too strange. Too good to be true. And things that seemed too good to be true usually were. But over the next few days, Maria couldn't stop thinking about the conversation. She went through her shifts at Riverside in a daze, still singing to Edward, still bringing flowers, but her mind was somewhere else. She kept pulling out James's business card and staring at it. She talked to Mrs. Chen, the only person she really trusted. The older woman listened to the whole story and then said something Maria didn't expect. When life gives you a door, you don't ask why it's there. You walk through it and see where it leads. Worst case, you come back out. But what if you don't? What if it's the door you've been waiting for? On the fourth day, Maria checked her bank account online, something she usually avoided because it was too depressing. She stared at the screen in shock. There was a deposit for $23,412, the exact amount of her remaining medical debt. There was a note with the transaction. For Lily, no strings attached. Maria called the number on the card. James answered on the second ring. You paid my debt, she said. I told you no. You did. But I didn't hear you, apparently. Maria, that money means nothing to me. It's a rounding error in my monthly budget. But for you, it's freedom. Don't send it back, use it. And while you're at it, let's talk about the rest of this plan. 2 weeks later, Maria found herself in a lawyer's office, signing contracts she could barely understand. James had hired an attorney to explain everything to her in plain language. She would be the director of a new memory care facility. Her starting salary would be $120,000 per year. Her tuition for nursing school would be fully paid. There was a benefits package that included health insurance for her and the kids, a retirement plan, and even a housing allowance. James had already purchased a property, a beautiful old mansion on 5 acres that had been converted to a medical facility years ago. He was hiring architects to redesign it based on Maria's vision. Natural light, comfortable spaces, a kitchen, gardens, everything she'd described in that diner booth at 6 a.m. I don't understand why you're doing all this, Maria said to James after she signed the last document. It's not just about your father, is it? James looked out the window of the lawyer's office. When my company sold, I had all this money and no idea what to do with it that actually mattered. I donated to charities, funded scholarships, all the things rich people are supposed to do. But it felt empty. Then I watched you sing to my father and I saw something real, something that actually makes a difference in someone's life. Right there in that moment. He turned back to her. My father was a teacher for 40 years. He touched thousands of lives. When the dementia took him, I felt like I was watching his legacy disappear. But then you came along and reminded me that kindness is its own legacy. I want to build something that honors that. And I need you to help me do it, Maria wiped her eyes. I'm going to cry again. I've cried more in the past 2 weeks than I have in 2 years. Happy tears, I hope, James said with a small smile. Terrified tears, Maria admitted. But yes, happy too. I keep waiting to wake up. You're not dreaming. This is real. And Maria, there's one more thing. James pulled out another folder. I want to create a foundation for training caregivers, funding research into better dementia care. providing scholarships for people like you who want to enter the field but can't afford it. I'm naming it after my father, the Edward Thornton Foundation for Compassionate Care. That's beautiful, Maria whispered. I want you to be on the board. Your voice, your experience, your perspective. That's what this foundation needs. Maria looked at all the papers in front of her. This new life spelled out in legal language. She thought about her kids, about giving them a real home, about finishing nursing school, about creating a place where people like Edward could live with dignity. When do we start? She asked. James smiled, a real smile this time. How about tomorrow? We have a facility to build and a lot of people to help. Maria shook his hand and then impulsively hugged him. Thank you. For seeing something in me I didn't even see in myself. Thank you, James said, for giving my father his humanity back. Everything else is just details. As Maria drove home that evening, the setting sun painting the sky orange and pink, she thought about how life could change in an instant. One song, one moment of kindness, one person who noticed. She couldn't wait to tell her kids. She couldn't wait to start this new chapter. And most of all, she couldn't wait to keep singing to Edward, but this time in a place designed just for people like him. A place where everyone mattered, where everyone was seen, where everyone was loved. The grand opening of Thornton Memory Care was on a crisp spring morning, 6 months after that conversation in the diner. Maria stood on the front steps of the renovated mansion, watching as the first residents arrived. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought everyone could hear it. She'd finished her nursing degree 2 months ago, studying in the evenings while overseeing the facility's construction during the day. Lily and Tommy had been there for the graduation ceremony, holding homemade signs that said, "Our mom is a nurse." She'd cried so hard she could barely see to accept her diploma. The mansion had been transformed into everything Maria had imagined and more. Large windows let in natural light that filled every room. The walls were painted in soft, warm colors, not the institutional white of most nursing homes. There were rocking chairs and comfortable couches, bookshelves filled with old classics, and a piano in the common room. The kitchen smelled like fresh bread because Maria had hired a cook who baked every morning. Just like she'd described to James, outside, there were raised garden beds where residents could plant flowers and vegetables. There was a walking path through the trees wide enough for wheelchairs with benches placed every 50 feet so people could rest and enjoy the view. But the most important thing was the staff. Maria had spent months interviewing and training caregivers. She didn't just look for people with experience or degrees. She looked for people who had compassion, who understood that their job was about dignity and connection, not just keeping people alive. Edward was the first resident to move in. James had insisted on it. Maria had decorated his room herself, hanging the old photographs she'd printed months ago, placing fresh flowers on his nightstand, making sure his favorite blue blanket was on the bed. When she helped Edward into his room that first day, he looked around with those faded blue eyes and said something he hadn't said in years. "Home," he whispered. Maria squeezed his hand. "Yes, Mr. Edward, you're home. Over the next few weeks." More residents moved in. Mrs. Patricia, who used to be a concert pianist and lit up whenever someone played music. Mr. Chen, who'd been a chef and loved helping in the kitchen even though he couldn't remember the recipes anymore. Dorothy, who thought she was still teaching school and organized imaginary lessons for imaginary students. Each person had a story. Each person mattered, and for the first time in Maria's career, she had the time and resources to truly care for them the way they deserved. James visited his father 3 times a week now. He'd sit with Edward in the garden, sometimes talking, sometimes just holding his hand in comfortable silence. Edward still didn't recognize him as his son, but that seemed to hurt less now. James had learned to appreciate the moments they had, whatever form they took. One afternoon, Maria found James sitting alone on a bench after a visit with Edward. He looked tired. "How was he today?" she asked, sitting down beside him. "Good. Confused but peaceful. He told me about teaching history to high school students. I don't think he was remembering actual events, just fragments of memories all mixed together, but he was happy telling the story. That's what matters," Maria said. James turned to look at her. "Do you know what I realized? I spent 2 years trying to make my father remember me, bringing in old photos, telling him stories about my childhood, desperately trying to unlock his memory, and I missed the point entirely. What do you mean? He doesn't need to remember who I was. He needs to feel safe and cared for right now in this moment. You taught me that. Every time you sang to him, you weren't trying to fix his memory. You were just giving him peace. Maria smiled softly. My grandmother used to say that love isn't about the past or the future. It's about showing up right now, in whatever way the person needs you to show up. They sat in silence for a while, watching the late afternoon sun filter through the trees. The foundation is getting applications from all over the country, James said. People who want to become caregivers but can't afford the training. We've received over 300 applications for the first 50 scholarships. I know, Maria said. I've been reading them. Every single story breaks my heart and gives me hope at the same time. The Edward Thornton Foundation had launched 3 months ago. It provided full scholarships for caregiver training, funded research into dementia care, and supported facilities that wanted to implement Maria's approach to elder care. Maria traveled 1 week each month, training other caregivers, sharing what she'd learned, teaching them to see the person behind the disease. She'd become something she never imagined. Not just a nurse, not just a director, but a voice for a different way of caring for the elderly. News articles had been written about the facility. Medical journals published papers about their approach. Other nursing homes were adopting their methods. But Maria's favorite part of every day was still the evening, when she made her rounds and sang to the residents who couldn't sleep. She'd sing to Edward first, those same Spanish lullabies her grandmother had taught her. Then she'd visit the others, each person getting their own song, their own moment of connection. The other staff members had started doing it too, not always singing, but finding their own ways to connect, reading poetry, telling stories, simply sitting and holding hands. The facility had a warmth that you could feel the moment you walked through the door. 2 years passed like a dream. Maria and her kids had moved into a small house near the facility, their first real home. Lily was doing well in school and wanted to be a doctor. Tommy had decided he wanted to work with elderly people, just like his mom. They'd visit the facility sometimes, and the residents loved seeing them. Edward's health had been declining slowly. It was expected, part of the natural progression. But he was comfortable, surrounded by care and kindness. James had made peace with the inevitable. One quiet evening in late autumn, Maria was singing to Edward as usual. His breathing had been labored all day, and she knew the end was close. James was there too, sitting on the other side of the bed. She sang the lullaby her grandmother had sung to her as a child, the one about stars watching over you while you sleep. Edward's eyes were closed, but he was smiling that peaceful smile she'd seen so many times. Halfway through the song, his breathing changed, slowed. James took his father's other hand, tears streaming down his face. "It's okay, Dad," James whispered. "You can rest now. We've got you." Maria kept singing, soft and gentle, as Edward took his last breath. It was peaceful, surrounded by love, exactly the way every ending should be. The funeral was small but beautiful. They played classical music, Edward's favorite. Former students came and shared stories about how he'd changed their lives. James gave a eulogy that made everyone cry, talking about how his father had taught him about education, but Maria had taught him about compassion. After the service, James and Maria walked through the gardens at the facility. He was at peace at the end, James said. "Because of you." "Because of us," Maria corrected. "You created this place. You made it possible. We created it together. And Maria, we're not done. There are thousands of people out there who need what we've built here. Thousands of families struggling like I was. Thousands of caregivers like you who just need a chance." Maria nodded. "I know. I get emails every day from people asking how they can create something similar in their communities. So we help them. We expand the foundation. We train more people. We show the world that there's a better way to care for our elderly. Not just warehousing them, but honoring them." Over the next 5 years, the foundation grew beyond anything Maria had imagined. 20 more facilities opened across the country, all following the Thornton model. Hundreds of caregivers received scholarships. The approach became standard curriculum in nursing schools. Maria became a nationally recognized expert in elder care, speaking at conferences, writing articles, changing policies. But she never stopped working hands-on with residents. Every evening she still made her rounds, still sang her songs, still held hands with people who needed to feel less alone. She thought often about that night at Riverside, when she'd sat in the dark singing to an old man she barely knew. How one small act of kindness had changed everything. Not just for her, not just for Edward, but for thousands of people she'd never meet. James had given her an opportunity, yes. But she'd given something too. She'd shown that compassion wasn't weakness. That taking time to truly see another person wasn't inefficient. That love, in its simplest form, was the most powerful medicine. On quiet nights, when Maria walked through the facility checking on sleeping residents, she'd sometimes stop and just listen. The gentle breathing, the occasional soft snore, the peaceful silence of people resting safely. This was her legacy. Not the awards or the articles or the recognition, but this, people living their final years with dignity, families finding peace, caregivers learning that their work wasn't just a job but a calling. She'd started with one song for one forgotten man, and somehow that had been enough to change the world. One person at a time, Maria would smile, adjust a blanket here, move a water glass closer there, and whisper the same thing she said every night. You matter. You're not alone, and tomorrow we'll be here again. Because that's what love does. It shows up, again and again, in the smallest moments, in the darkest nights, in the songs we sing when nobody's watching, except someone is always watching, and sometimes that changes everything.